Hi, this is Carl with another SOP video for managed service providers. Today I want to talk about when should you update your documentation. This also applies to processes and procedures. Luckily, there's a very clear answer. It depends. The answer to when should I update my documentation depends in large part on the documentation itself. So for example, if you're talking about a procedure for monthly maintenance, where every month you test the client's bandwidth, make sure that their battery backups are working, right, all that happy stuff, that is something that at the end of the checklist, the last item should be update the checklist. So your processes and procedures are always up to date with all of those things where the changes are probably going to be minor because the checklist is used on a regular basis. So if you refer to some documentation all the time, it should basically always be up to date. Because this is the kind of small minutia that gets updated. A website might have changed, the look and feel of something has changed, the menus are changed, whatever. So that should just be noted month to month as you go through procedure or documentation. A second time that you should update documentation is before you execute a major project. So for example, think about moving a client to cloud services. You want to first make sure all your documentation is up to spec. You know where the databases are, you know where files are stored, you know where the email is, you know how big the mailboxes are, all that stuff that sort of, it falls by the wayside in day-to-day operations. But you should bring it up to spec before you start working on forklifting it over to cloud services. And then the actual process, the checklists for migration, should also be updated very close to when you actually execute them, because they might be referring to documentation that had a different setup, or files were on a different server, or whatever. And so you need to make sure that you know exactly where you're moving things from and where you're moving things to. A piece of this, and I'll just give you one example, would be, for example, doing an audit of where the data are actually stored. Who's got some database on their desktop that they never told you about? Who moved something from the server to their desktop or to a local machine for some temporary thing that never got put back on the server? And so now, if you move all that data to the cloud, you're going to miss something because somebody didn't tell you that they had made a change. After all, clients don't think about this the same way you do. So it's not top of their mind, like, oh, I should make sure that Carl knows that we moved that database to a local machine. So doing a tune-up right before you do a major project will make sure that things go very smoothly. And of course, all that documentation, knowing where things are, is something that in a perfect world, they would all be up to date every day, but we don't live in that world. But it's also something that it can be brought up to date pretty quickly as long as you had good documentation the first time. And everything you do along those lines is going to make that migration go as smoothly as possible. This is a great example of the rule, slow down, get more done. Another opportunity to update documentation is when you're onboarding a new employee, or in some cases, onboarding a new client. When you're going to go use something that is being introduced to somebody for the first time, make sure it's right, so you don't start training somebody and then say, oh, accept that, accept this, and normally this would be over here, and yeah, that's an old screenshot. Don't do any of that crap. Just take a little extra time and go through it before you onboard the client or the employee or whatever it might be. Make sure that those things are all square and up to date before you go to use them. In general, documentation that is rarely used is, oddly enough, probably up to date, because if it's rarely used, the big picture is the sites that you're visiting or the tools you're using are probably not changed very much. It's the stuff that's day to day. The details of a desktop setup, for example, might change between Apple and Microsoft and Adobe, right? They might change many, many things over the course of a month or 2 months. So the more frequently something is used, the more likely it is that that documentation needs to be updated. Now, the reality is, if you hire somebody today and you tune up your documentation, and then they just use it for the next year, well, minor changes, they're just going to have rolled into that, and they don't really need it to be updated and so forth and so on. But as soon as you go to hire the next person, or you ask that person who's no longer new to train the new person, that's your opportunity to make sure all that documentation is up to spec. The bottom line is that documentation should save you time and therefore money. As a result, it should be updated frequently enough that it actually saves you time and money. Don't go through all of your documentation every week. The older your company gets and the more successful you are, the longer and longer and longer that will take. So don't commit to something like that. Now, one of the questions I get very frequently is, well, what happens if I find an oddity? My documentation is generally good, but we have this weird thing that happens. Should I document that? Like 9 times out of 10, we know what's going to happen, but that one time, something else happens. Well, here's a nice rule to make your life a little easier. Don't document the exceptions to the rule. You might put a note in that says, weird stuff might happen here, but don't document the weird stuff. Don't say 1 time out of 10 or 1 time out of 20, this other thing is going to happen. If somebody is familiar enough with the process, then when they hit the oddball thing, they're going to be able to roll with the flow, especially if you got a little note in there. But don't change the documentation with this entire subtext that is geared towards the exception to the rule. Remember, ultimately, you are successful if you can document 80 or 90% of everything. That is gargantuan, and trying to document an extra 1%, an extra 5% is far more expensive and time-consuming than it is worth. So do not document the exceptions to the rule. Now, having said that, as time rolls on, if those exceptions become more and more and more normal, and now it is, 50% of the time you're going to have this other thing happen, well, it's no longer an exception. It's now gradually and slowly becoming part of the norm. Then it's time to document it. Some of this, as they say, is more art than science, but the bottom line is you look at the big, big picture. Will documenting this save us money in the long run? If the answer is yes, do it and update it. If the answer is no, then don't worry about it and you'll sleep just fine tonight. For Small Biz Thoughts, this is Carl Palachuk wishing you the best of luck in your managed service business.